This interview was originally recorded on October 10th, 2023. Welcome to Everyone Eats. I'm Jeremy Bowditch. If I say the words do not pass go, what comes to mind? Monopoly. We all played it growing up. Your grandparents probably played it growing up. You buy properties and charge other players rent. Build hotels, charge higher rent, and the last person standing wins. It's supposed to be this lesson on business, kids learning how the world works. Except it's not. This blew my mind, but the game is a satire. It's meant to show how unfair our housing system is. Created in 1904 by Elizabeth Magie, it was originally called the landlords game. She believed income from land should be shared by everyone in society. The game had two phases, the landlords game and the prosperity game. In the first phase, all the wealth is concentrated in one player, and the game ends when everyone else is evicted and dies on the street. This is the Monopoly game we all know. But players could at any time vote to change the rules, to literally change the game. In this next phase, the prosperity game, the rent is split equally among everyone, and the game ends when the person in last place doubles the money they started with. This is from the 1932 version of the original game. Quote, "Do you want to be wealthy? Play the landlord's game and learn how. Do you want prosperity? Play prosperity game and find out. The landlord's game shows why our national housekeeping has gone wrong, and prosperity game shows how to start it right and keep it going right." End quote. That was more than 100 years ago when she first created this game. And her idea was that prosperity is when everyone wins, when everyone eats. We don't need to be in a Great Depression or Great Recession or Vibe Session or whatever you want to call it to know we have a housing problem in Los Angeles. 73% of households are rent burdened, spending over 30% of household income on rent and utilities. 48% are severely rent burdened, spending over 50% of household income on rent and utilities. That's according to a 2019 survey from the USC Price Center for Social Innovation. The rent is too damn high. High rent leads to eviction. Eviction leads to being unhoused. Being unhoused leads to death. In Los Angeles, 6 people die from lack of shelter every day. But it doesn't have to be that way. A better world is possible. So let's get to it. Imagining a new Los Angeles and challenging the way things are. We believe a person's right to their basic needs is greater than anyone's right to make a profit. Free healthcare, free education, public housing, fair wages, a world without police or prisons. It's all possible if we fight for it together. Each episode, we open a bottle of wine and take a look at a basic need for all Angelinos. Who has it? Who goes without? Why? And what can we do about it? I talk to activists, educators, advocates, and people just trying to make ends meet. Join me, Jeremy Bowditch, as we imagine a Los Angeles where everyone eats. My guest today is Jacob Woocher, an eviction attorney representing the Hillside Villa tenants and their long-running struggle against rent hikes and eviction. He's also an organizer with the Los Angeles Tenants Union and an author of a 10-part series called LA's War on Public Housing for Knock.LA. Everyone Eats is inspired by People City Council, formed as a platform for different racial, economic, and environmental justice organizations to come together and fight for the city that we, the people, want. Find out more at peoplecitycouncil-la.com. Welcome back to Everyone Eats. I'm your host, Jeremy Bowditch. Give it up for Jacob Woocher joining us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's lovely here.
Before I ask you to tell us a little bit about your background, I'm just going to let you know I'm going to be opening up a bottle of wine on the show. We reject the idea that all nice things should be for the wealthy and anything public should be run down and decrepit. That is not the way it has to be. And so we're going to pop into a 2022 Nebbiolo. That's the grape. Hey, Hey, there we go. I'm going to pour you up some wine. And I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about your background and how you got into the work that you're doing.
Sure, yeah. I was born and raised in LA. I went to college on the East Coast and worked 1 year on the East Coast and then came back in 2017 to go to the Masters of Planning program at UCLA and got very involved in the tenants movement, joined the Los Angeles Tenants Union, which I'm still a member of, decided to go to law school, and my day job is defending people in eviction court from landlords and the sheriff. And my organizing is with the Los Angeles Tenants Union for the most part, and we're all volunteers, so nobody is paid to be on staff. We're not a legal services provider. We're a political organization. We have different chapters all across the city. So we are mostly within the city of Los Angeles, sometimes crossing into areas that are outside the city boundaries. And yeah, like you said, we are a huge resource for people who are in crisis. All of the local chapters have regular meetings where anyone who's having a problem with their landlord can come by and get some help. Really, the key is ideally to intervene before the legal process of eviction ever gets started. Because landlords will target tenants when they think that they're isolated. Landlords will target tenants when they think that they have no one assisting them, that they're not part of any community, they're not part of any organization, they're not going to know their rights, they're not going to be able to get a lawyer if they get brought into the legal eviction process. So a lot of what the LA Tenants Union is doing is responding to those crises before the legal eviction ever even starts. And then once the eviction starts, there's all sorts of things that the LA Tenants Union does to help, whether it's literally prepping people for in the courtroom or putting pressure on the landlord outside of the courtroom. I would say that's one side of the organizing. That's sort of the more reactive side of the organizing. There's also a political, sort of explicitly political proactive side of the organizing in terms of building neighborhood power, community power. We don't tend to get involved with policy per se so much. You know, we're not really writing legislation, but we are putting out clear demands, I think, pretty regularly. So during COVID, the Los Angeles Tenants Union was really pushing the demand to cancel rent, for example. So many people were suddenly just out of a job, and we see it in our meetings every single week that people just couldn't pay rent. And when you can't pay rent, if there's not really strong eviction protections, or in our analysis, just rent being canceled, people were going to get evicted. So we were pushing cancel rent. We were telling people, pay for your food, don't pay for your rent. You need food to survive, right? Your landlord will be fine. It's very imperfect, and this is a classic way that the state responds and waters down radical demands. But I think because of a lot of the organizing for cancel rent and basically the rent strikes that people were engaging in, you got a very strong response from the state in terms of a rental assistance program, which again was very far from perfect and ultimately ended up lining the pockets of the landlords. But that's just one example. Another example of what the LA Tenants Union is pushing for politically right now is a rent freeze for the city of Los Angeles. For hundreds of thousands of units starting in February, landlords are going to be able to raise the rent by 7%, 9% if the landlord pays utilities. Our wages haven't gone up though, right?
They have not.
Everything's gotten more expensive. People are not getting 7% wage increases, so why is the rent going up 7%? We know that's just going to lead to more homelessness. We know it's just going to lead to more overcrowding. That's another thing that the LA Tenants Union is pushing for right now. And then in terms of the long-term vision, I think there's a lot of more work to be done, but the Los Angeles Tenants Union is certainly pushing for a world without rent, a world without landlords. We don't need them.
Speak on it.
They just take our money every month. They don't do repairs. They don't care if you live or if you die.
I want to ask you, since we're already on the tenants union topic, what are some of the ways that the union can kind of lean on landlords? You said before the process starts. What is available to people to fight back before they get into eviction court?
There's so much you can do. I mean, it starts often with just sending a letter. So someone comes in, maybe their landlord's harassing them, maybe their landlord is trying to raise their rent. We try to think of it not as what does the law allow, but what is right. So maybe your landlord's allowed to raise the rent. That doesn't mean it's right. We can still fight back, right? You can send a letter. That's maybe the very first step. Like that's very low key, right? You can increase to protests. So there have been cases, a lot of cases under the Los Angeles Tenants Union of tenants finding out where their landlords live and protesting outside of their homes. These people are trying to throw our neighbors out of their homes so we can come to their homes and, number one, make them a little bit uncomfortable, and number two, tell the whole neighborhood what they're doing to families on the other side of town, right? So it sort of ranges from these different tactics, different levels of pressure you can put on. And yeah, very often we see landlords, especially when they're doing something that is illegal or is questionably legal, back down. Once they realize the tenant is supported, once there's a little bit more pressure on them, and naming them and shaming them is a classic tactic, putting them on social media, sharing photos of these landlords. Those types of tactics often will yield results, and you'll see landlords backing down because of the community power, not because lawyers got involved, right? Not because someone with a law degree came in and wrote a threatening letter to them, but because people got together and used the power of their community to put pressure on the landlord.
It sounds like if they're willing to back down from these claims or trying to throw people out or raise the rents without any legal obligation to do so, that to me feels like someone who doesn't believe in the actions they're taking.
Totally. A friend of mine lives at this building. I don't know if they want this to be public, so I'll keep them anonymous. But this building that engaged in a very well-known rent strike in the city of Los Angeles a few years ago, I'm now friends with one of the people who lives there, and they were able to get half of their rent canceled, essentially. Aside from any rental assistance they got, they were able to get half of their rent canceled. So they owed $20-something thousand. They came to an agreement at a building-wide level with the landlord that, instead of owing $20-something thousand for the past 15 months, whatever it was, they only owe about $10,000. Just because the community came together a couple years ago and protested at the landlord's home and shamed him in the media for trying to gentrify their neighborhood, immediately he's already back down in terms of collecting all this past COVID rental debt.
Right.
So I think that's a great example of just the power of organizing with your building and forming a tenants association in your building, and then being connected as well to the LA Tenants Union local in your neighborhood and the entire LA Tenants Union organization across the city of Los Angeles. Since March of 2020, for rent-controlled units in Los Angeles, that's basically if you're in an apartment building that was built before 1979, generally you have rent control. They couldn't raise your rent at all. That's how it should be. I really don't see any reason why rents should go up a cent higher, right? But as I'm speaking right now, starting in 2024, February, landlords will have the option for rent-controlled units to raise the rent by 7%.
It's a one-time increase?
Every year they can do it. They sort of publish it a couple months in advance. It's wild because it's technically the way the law is written is it's tied in some complicated formula to inflation. So the housing department looks at inflation.
Oh my
right.
God.
So it's like everything else is getting more expensive. Let's make your rent more expensive too.
Oh my God, Jacob.
Yeah.
I, for some reason, saw that 7% number and thought, okay, it used to be 2 or 3%. Surely that is a one-time catch up. The pandemic, we had to get froze for a minute. We couldn't do, so we'll give you a one-time 7% jump to get your beak wet, line your pockets a little bit. But then we'll go back to normal 2-3% a year. You're saying rent-controlled buildings in Los Angeles are going to go to 7% yearly increases. And just to be clear, if you don't live in a rent-controlled building, let's say like you live in something that was built recently, you don't have rent control, and they could double your rent tomorrow for no reason.
Yeah, there's this like super weak statewide rent control. I mean, it's not even rent control. It doesn't even deserve that name. And basically, you can get 10% rent increases every year. 5 years with 10% rent increases every year, your rent's going up a lot. There's no way people can afford it.
We'll be right back with eviction attorney Jacob Woocher. Everyone Eats is inspired by White People for Black Lives, a white anti-racist collective and activist project who strongly believe white folks can play a progressive and supportive role in amplifying the voices and demands of Black people, moving the white community to take a more active and participatory stance for racial justice and applying strategic pressure on institutions to change racist policies. Find out more at awarela.org/white-people-for-black-lives. Welcome back. Now more of my conversation with tenants' rights advocate Jacob Woocher.
Landlords were crying about the COVID eviction protections, which
Yes.
weren't even that strong in a million ways, had all sorts of loopholes. How many landlords do you think were made homeless by the COVID eviction protections?
Right.
I would say probably zero. So in the middle of a historic homelessness crisis, we're really going to prioritize the needs of the landlords? I mean, it's ridiculous. When the city and the county was debating ending the COVID protections in first month or two of 2023, just seeing these politicians throw out the sympathy for the landlords was outrageous. I mean, just no sense of perspective of who's actually the parties that are suffering here, right? You know, on the West Side right now, it's really disgusting. There are mostly white homeowners who are vehemently protesting this proposed permanent housing of some sort that is going to go up on Pico Boulevard. And it's gross. These are people who consider themselves liberals. These are people who vote Democrat, Biden supporters, whatever.
Talk to us a little bit about the Hillside Villa situation, what's going on over there, and your involvement.
The Hillside Villa Apartments is a 124-unit building in Chinatown, just north of downtown LA, that was built in the 1980s, subject to an affordable agreement, essentially, where the landlord was required to keep the building affordable for 30 years. So then those 30 years come, and it's 2018, and tenants get notified by the landlord that their rent is going up sometimes 200%. So there are families whose rent went up, I believe, from $845 to $2,450, right? That's a tripling of their rent.
Yeah. Wow.
Fortunately, the tenants formed a tenants association. They organized with the LA Tenants Union and Chinatown Community for Equitable Development and have been fighting back for going on 5 years now. I believe this winter it's going to be 5 years. Originally, the city was trying to make a deal with the landlord, Tom Botts. He's a rich white guy who lives in Malibu. That deal fell apart. That was back in 2019. Since then, the tenants have been calling on the city to use eminent domain, which is essentially expropriation. They use it to build freeways.
Dodger Stadium,
Staples Center, the Convention Center.
And by expropriation, you mean using legal authority to take land from people who have it to use it for the state's needs.
Exactly. Take land. You have to pay the landlord essentially market value, which I don't think is good. I think that should be changed, but that's not my decision. That's how the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution. So you have to pay market value, and you have to use it for a public purpose. An affordable housing, keeping housing affordable, is very clearly a public purpose under the law. So the tenants have been calling for this since 2019, I would say the winter of 2019, 2020. We've been calling for the city to expropriate Hillside Villa, keep 124 units permanently affordable, because right now, again, under Tom Botts' ownership, he is raising the rents to market rate. So this is a rapidly gentrifying, very poor neighborhood. People don't understand that about Chinatown. It's one of the poorest neighborhoods in Los Angeles, but is rapidly changing demographically because it's so close to downtown. It's right across the freeway from Bunker Hill. And
next door to Echo Park.
Next door to Echo Park, across the freeway from the Walt Disney Concert Hall and the Broad and all those fancy museums.
Mm-hmm.
And the tenants are fighting for expropriation. It's a radical idea. It's not something the city has ever done to help poor people. It's something the city does all the time for priorities that align with what rich people want, like we talked about, building Dodger Stadium, the Staples Center.
Freeways,
Bunker Hill, the entire neighborhood of Bunker Hill. Was raised through eminent domain, right? And the Hillside Villa tenants are essentially arguing that we are in such a deep crisis. These are families that are very poor. They are either going to be made homeless or have to leave maybe the county of LA or the state of California entirely if they are evicted. So we've been fighting for years for the city to expropriate the building, keep it permanently affordable. It's been a long, drawn-out process of going through city council, going through the courts. The city is currently making its way towards conducting an appraisal of the building, which is one of the steps legally that's necessary before they can expropriate the property. Meanwhile, tenants are fighting evictions in court. So we have around 20 evictions right now that are already in the unlawful detainer legal process. There are probably going to be maybe 10 or so, a dozen more to come within a month or two. So it's a battle. It's been a battle. The tenants have been protesting the politicians, protesting the landlord, putting a lot of pressure on the city to really point the way forward in terms of what are more aggressive steps the city can take to protect affordable housing, to keep poor people in their homes, to use these very powerful tools that the government has to help people rather than to displace people.
A battle between the hillside tenants and the landlord has been going on for years. Last year, tenants asked the city council to step in and purchase the property through eminent domain, complaining of rising rent. They say some tenants have already received 3-day notices to pay or quit.
We don't want to be homeless, and we want to stay there. We are not asking to be free as a tenant, but we want to pay the one that we can afford.
So I see this struggle certainly from a policy perspective as the leading edge, really, on what it looks like to take the idea of protecting tenants seriously. This has taken such a long time because at every step of the way, the city has been dragging its feet, whether it is city council itself. I mean, it took us a couple years to get them to pass that motion that then directed the housing department to get the appraisal and to make an offer to the landlord, which again is the first step that has to happen before eminent domain is invoked. Then the housing department dragged their feet. Instead of immediately moving towards the appraisal, Ann Sewell, the director of the housing department, wanted to try to negotiate with Tom Botts to see if he would sell the building willingly, which he's been saying very clearly this whole time that he's not going to do. So she wasted 6 or 8 months doing that. Then finally, they file the court papers necessary to get access for the appraisal. When it's helping poor people, at every step of the way, the city figures out a way to drag its feet and to slow down the process.
You've mentioned tenants associations a couple times. I'm wondering, how would someone go about starting one where they live?
Yeah, it's a good question. So usually we say at the building level, it's called a tenants association. Mm-hmm. And then the tenants union is the citywide organization that's made up of
all the associations,
all the different associations.
Okay, so we're forming an association. My neighbors are angry. I texted everyone. They're coming over my place in an hour. What am I saying to them? And then what's our steps to take action?
The first step is often writing a letter to the landlord of what your demands are, right? Because you're not just forming a tenants association for no reason. There's usually some sort of crisis or some sort of event that kicks off the drive to organize. So usually it's basically coming up with a name for yourself. Often people use the street that they're located on, the Pico Boulevard Tenants Association, whatever, and sending a letter to your landlord. Ideally, everyone signs the letter so the landlord sees how powerful you are. I think sometimes there's a lot of fear of being targeted, which is understandable, but that's the beauty of being part of a collective is that you can stick up for one another, right? If you're just on your own, you get targeted. If it's one person on their own, the landlord might go after them. If it's 15 people acting together, it's not going to really work the same. And then based on what the landlord does, or maybe they totally ignore you, then it's sort of a process of escalation. What do we need to do to get these people's attention?
Right.
And then it goes back to the different tactics that we use. And if anyone's interested, there is a tenant association handbook on the Los Angeles Tenants Union website in English and Spanish that's very helpful.
Since you're an attorney and you're an advocate for working people, for renters, for people who need housing, for people who are being exploited, et cetera, how do you use the existing framework, which was designed not to help us, for advocacy?
We have to start from the understanding that the cards are absolutely stacked against tenants in the legal process. Evictions are what's called a summary proceeding, which means they go really quickly. There are special rules, so you can't counter sue in an eviction. If your landlord sues you, there's no such thing as a cross complaint that you can file. So evictions are for landlords to get their property back as soon as possible. If a tenant gets served with an eviction lawsuit and they don't respond within 5 days, not including weekends, they lose automatically. And that is how a huge portion of evictions that get filed in Los Angeles or across California really end. without the tenant even having a chance to put up a fight. So the legal system is absolutely stacked against tenants. Just think about how many people are unhoused in the county of Los Angeles. It's what, like 70,000, right?
76.
76? There's
Yeah.
not like one little tweak that we can do that makes this all better. It's going to involve vast redistribution of resources from, in my opinion, from the rich and from the police. That's the only way forward in terms of having a city that makes progress towards really taking care of people and keeping people off the street. Over the last several decades, there has seemingly been a consensus that public housing was a failure in this country. And I don't think that narrative holds up when you look at the actual evidence. That evidence is that, number one, tenants in Los Angeles and elsewhere have again and again fought to protect their public housing when it is threatened by demolition. So if public housing has been such a failure, why do residents fight back to protect that very same public housing every time the housing authority comes in and tells them it's going to be privatized, right? So I think we can be bold and unapologetic in saying that everyone deserves public housing. Certainly public housing in this country has not been perfect. It's been intentionally underfunded. It's been intentionally over-policed. But that's not how it has to be. In the 1930s and 1940s, there were really robust social movements demanding not only decent and actually beautiful public housing. There were some really well-known architects like Richard Neutra who designed some of the most beautiful housing I've ever seen in LA that was public housing during the war years, actually. Not only were people fighting for public housing, but they were fighting for things like recreation centers and community health centers and education and childcare. So people were thinking of public housing as the basis for really a socialist future where our lives are not subject to the whims of profit-driven landlords. If your income goes down, your rent can go down too. In public housing, your income is no more than 10%. And that means if your income drops to zero, instead of waking up to an eviction notice on your door the next month, your rent goes down to accommodate it, right? And that's how public housing actually works. Like, that's not some sort of fantasy. That's how it actually works. During COVID, when everyone was calling for cancel rent, right? Public housing actually was canceling rent. Not always, I think part of the history that I've written about is that the housing authority doesn't really often do what is best for the tenants, but they did in many cases in LA and elsewhere because the federal government told housing authorities very explicitly, hey, if people come to you and they say that their rent or their income went down, you can retroactively go back in time and lower their rent to match the drop in income. So to me, the future that I imagine where nobody's unhoused, where nobody has to worry about losing a job and losing your housing and being out on the street, that future looks like mass public housing. Like public libraries, let's have the state pay for it, let's give it to everybody who needs it, and there's no reason that in one of the wealthiest places in the world, anybody should be hungry, anybody should be living on the street. We have the resources to house everybody. The number one force in opposition to mass public housing has to be the real estate industry, because the real estate industry doesn't want that competition of the state building public housing because their profits depend on desperate people having no other options.
Artificial scarcity.
They don't want the state coming in and building a bunch of housing because that would lower prices. The real estate industry, number one. I think homeowners, absolutely. They don't want to be taxed. They don't want money to be redistributed. They don't want the LAPD to lose any funding. So I think it has to be the real estate industry, I think in the sense of both landlords / developers / financiers and property owners who own big homes on the west side, in other parts of the city. I would say those are the main forces. And they, of course, influence the entire politics of the city. What it would look like for those forces to come down, cutting off a big chunk of LAPD's funding would be a good start. Something that I point to often is that if you diverted 1% of LAPD funding, you could fully modernize all of LA's public housing stock. So the city estimates that it takes about $533 million to that's the capital needs of our public housing right now. That's the latest estimate. Over 20 years, $533 million. If you took 1% of LAPD's budget for 20 years, that's the same. Or it's even more, actually. It's $600 million. So just 1% of LAPD's budget over the next 20 years can fully repair and modernize our public housing. It would also look like, of course, building new housing. So I think between acquiring housing and building housing, that is really the route to getting mass public housing. But I'm glad you put a number on it. You said $1 billion. Let's say chop off $1 billion of LAPD. That's the type of money we need to talk about, because we're not making a dent with $100 million here, $50 million there.
Right.
It's going to take a huge amount of resources to actually change anything. But we have the resources. We have it. I think there are like 58 billionaires in LA. There are so many very rich people, really rich corporations. We've got the resources. There's really no excuse.
I was talking to Dr. Melina Abdullah, and she's with the Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, but also the People's Budget LA Project. And she says every year they do a social scientific survey with 25,000 plus respondents. And this is done by people from Berkeley, UCLA, et cetera. And every year they release the numbers and they present it to the city in various degrees of success. But this year, she said the number one priority people wanted was mental health, to use the city resources. She said number two, and she said it's always number two or number one, was housing. Mm-hmm. She was like, people want to reduce the police budget and the parking enforcement budget, she said, down to almost nothing, right? The people, this is the people who currently live in LA, right?
Totally.
Like, it sounds like we could do that already, but we choose not to. We'll be right back with tenants' rights advocate Jacob Woocher. Everyone Eats is inspired by La Defensa, a FEM-led 501c4 advocacy organization dedicated to shifting Los Angeles County's reliance on criminalization and incarceration towards systems of care that center human dignity. Find out more at ladefensa.org. Welcome back to Everyone Eats. Now more of my conversation with tenants' rights advocate Jacob Woocher. I want to ask you about kind of like the levers of power, state violence, resisting that, non-compliance. When does the sheriff shows up with a pistol on his hip and says, I have a piece of paper saying you're being evicted. We may say that's unethical, but at the same time, this person is armed. Yeah. And if you resist this unjust action, there's a chance you could lose your life. You could be maimed.
Yeah.
Who knows? You could be incarcerated, et cetera. You know, when you're dealing with state violence, when you're dealing with that kind of coercion, when you're seeing the kind of tip of the spear of these kind of like wealthy forces we talked about, right, that kind of want to maintain the system as it is. You being an attorney, what's your advice? You know, how much do we kind of accept, right, from the system, from the police, from the sheriff, from these capitalists, from our landlords, et cetera, who basically are like, if you can't give me this much money by this date, we're going to come with violence and put you outside on the street, whereby you know your chances of dying skyrocket. 6 people die on the streets every day in Los Angeles from being unhoused. And the way the system is set up, resisting that in any way is categorized, right, as like, you're a criminal. So as an attorney, what's your opinion on non-compliance, nonviolent protest, resistance? Like, where's that spectrum? How squishy is it? And like, I don't know, what would you recommend for people who kind of are up against it?
As an attorney, I have no comment.
Right.
As an organizer, I would say thank you for bringing that perspective. I think it is really important to see evictions as violent. The systems are set up in such a way where that violence is masked, right? That violence is hidden behind these legalistic, bureaucratic procedures of the state. But fundamentally, if you don't leave when the state tells you to, some guys with guns are coming up and gonna force you out, right? I think it goes back to a very simple maxim that it is just and righteous to resist unjust laws. I don't think we should be hemmed in by what our current society decides is legal, because I think I'm sure people who are listening understand that what's legal is not the same as what's just.
Right.
Strategically, though, actually taking those steps, that's a much different question, right? We can say abstractly, of course it's just, and in my opinion, totally rational and righteous to resist an eviction by force, getting a bunch of your people together and physically blockading. When it comes down to practice, it's much more difficult to do, right? And you're totally right. People are going to have to put themselves on the line. People are going to have to risk being hauled off to jail. Certain people are more vulnerable than others. I think if people have certain privileges in that respect, I think it's even more important for them to be involved in that stuff. I mean, ultimately, these things need to be dramatized and they need to be really made clear, the stakes of this. Like you said, eviction equals death. I mean, we have the LA Tenants Union has a bumper sticker that says eviction equals death. One of the members on the West Side, shout out to Gary, he came to our meeting because he saw a bumper sticker and he was facing eviction. He said, you know what? That is eviction equals death. He's an elderly person who lives in a rent-controlled unit in Santa Monica. And that messaging totally spoke to him, because that's the reality for a ton of people. Like you said, people get evicted and they die on the street because it's a lot harder to live when you don't have decent shelter. So those are the stakes. And I think understanding that violence is at the root of evictions right now, and violence has always been at the root of private land ownership, is super important.
When we talk to people who come on the show, we like to imagine what's possible, talk about what powers or forces are in our way, what levers we can yank on and pull. And always we discover that there are people doing this work already, right? Like no one's working in a vacuum. With solidarity, we can all lean in and find that we're stronger together. So you mentioned the LA Tenants Union. You mentioned forming a tenants association for your building or your block if you're getting harassed or you have grievances. Who are some of the other organizations who are kind of advocating for tenants, maybe people who are helping or wishing for more housing stock, more public housing, removing the kind of barriers to eminent domain and things for the Hillside Villa Group, people who are fighting that fight, advancing this idea that you shouldn't have to please the shareholders to live inside, right? So who in LA can they tap in? Someone's heard this episode. They like what you're saying. They want to catch the next train to Advocacy Town. Where can they get on? Who should they talk to?
I would definitely say start with joining the Los Angeles Tenants Union local in your neighborhood. We're all across the city, and that's a really good place to start. There are all sorts of other orgs doing good work. Los Angeles Community Action Network is organizing mostly on Skid Row and has been around for decades and just has an amazing analysis of things and does amazing work. Stop LAPD Spying, I think, is really always on the cutting edge of the type of work they're doing against the LAPD, advocating for that same sort of redistribution of resources, not just focused on police surveillance and police violence, but really having a systemic and anti-colonial analysis of the city of Los Angeles. DSA, I think, is a good way to tap in for a lot of folks. I started out in DSA.
So did I.
Democratic Socialists of America. And then there's a lot of different nonprofits. I sort of often encourage people to think beyond some of the nonprofit politics we see. I mean, I think there are a lot of organizations that are simultaneously doing good work but have a very limited vision of the way that change is made and the types of demands that can be placed on the state and on politicians. But yeah, there's a number of nonprofits that are advocating for this similar type of stuff. I would start there.
Thank you for coming on Everyone Eats. Thank you for telling us about your experience fighting for people who are being evicted in our courts, advocating in the streets and organizing with the Hillside Villa Apartments Association, and just renters and people everywhere in the city and the county who want to stay housed, right? So thank you for coming by.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.
The end of eviction, rent abolition, public housing. It's all available if we fight for it together. Thanks so much to Jacob Woocher for coming on the show. You can learn more about his work with LA Tenants Union at latenantsunion.org. You can follow LA Tenants Union on Instagram at LA Tenants. Jacob Woocher's 10-part series on public housing in Los Angeles can be found at knock-la.com. Also, we have an update on the Hillside Villa tenants. Since we recorded this interview, there have been some breakthroughs. Their 4-year-long rent strike, one of the longest in LA history, has resulted in a court victory in October of 2024. Almost all evictions have been dismissed. A better world is possible if we fight for it together. Thanks for listening to Everyone Eats. The show is hosted by me, Jeremy Bowditch. I'm also a producer on the show. So is Joy Sanford and Dan Gallucci. The show is recorded at Boyle Heights Beat in Boyle Heights, Los Angeles, California. Follow the show on social media at Everyone Eats LA and our website, everyoneeats.la.